David Cicerchi, we're at it again. It's good to see you, my friend.
Yeah, great to see you, Ronen. Good to be here.
Today we want to talk about pleasure, as I understand our intention for the day. One of my favorite topics. I had a
Who doesn't have this as their favorite topic? I think.
well,
Just
there
don't
are
admit it.
those who have run away from pleasure their whole lives, and entire cultures have set pleasure up as an icon to fear. And I think part of what my intention is today is to help burst through that and to put pleasure back where it belongs at the center of our human experience. I had a friend that I've mentioned a lot, and sometimes in these videos as well, Jerry Judd. He was one of the co-founders of Shalom Mountain, a retreat center in New York. And my friend Jerry used to say, pleasure is God's way of letting you know what he wants for you. And those who knew Jerry were not all that puzzled by it, because we had an understanding that he was not simply talking about chocolate and sex and the pleasures of the senses. But I'm not sure everybody who heard that understood that he was not talking about that limited notion of pleasure. So one of my hopes for today is that both of us can flesh out a broader meaning of pleasure, if it is going to serve as a breadcrumb or a trail of breadcrumbs for us to follow in our lives, then what are we exactly following and where might it lead us? Why don't you take it from there?
Yeah. So it's just really interesting, when we hear the word pleasure, if whoever's listening can think like, what is the first thing that comes to mind, right? And oftentimes we hear pleasure and there's something decadent about it. It's like, oh, pleasure, it's a chocolate cake, and if I have too much chocolate cake, I'm going to get fat and I should feel guilty about that. Or it's, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church basically, when we had to go to confession, and they gave us a little card to fill out to talk about our sins, and basically the questions were related to, have you pleasured yourself lately, right? And it's like, you should feel guilty about that, right? And so we all have our associations with pleasure, and as you said, there's been whole religions set up, to demonize pleasure. And yet what we're doing here, thanks to our mutual teacher who's written a lot about this, is actually reweave pleasure into the fabric of reality, right? And you mentioned Jerry Judd talking about it's God's way to tell us what he wants for us, what God wants for us. Another way to look at it is pleasure is the way that reality evolves. Actually, reality evolves, as Dr. Mark Gaffney said, because it feels good, right? And we have to make a clarification that we also assume that we think of pleasure as, physical pleasure, but we're actually here weaving together a whole complete map of reality that brings in every level of pleasure. So not just this first, and we can go to maybe each of these levels as we get into our conversation, but we're actually looking at reality in all of its expressions, pleasure in all of its expressions. And also Dr. Mark Gaffney often quotes a writer, Kathy Kaufman, I believe her name was, and she coined the term quantum hedonism. And basically pointing to, at every level of reality, at the smallest, the quantum level, there's a drive for pleasure. Molecules, atoms come together, and subatomic particles come together because at that level, in a not in the way that we experience pleasure, but in the way that a subatomic particle experiences pleasure, actually seeking the pleasure of coming together and forming an atom.
Right. So right there,
Right? And so that's
we're broadening the definition of pleasure beyond the human or even animalistic notion of pleasure. It's a fundamental quality of the cosmos. As I've heard this piece of the discussion, it's almost as though this electron floating free out here is yearning to connect to something else, and then when it does connect to another subatomic particle to make something bigger, some new whole, there's a kind of a pleasure both in for that subatomic particle and for the new whole that's been created.
Exactly. Right. And all of those are living within us, right? We're made up of atoms and subatomic particles, right? And all the way up. And it's evolutionary pleasure. And it's taken billions of years for all of those connections and those yearnings, allurements into pleasurable bonds that create atoms and molecules and go on and on and on to create you and me right here, right now, right? And so all that is occurring within us. Our very experience of being a human is designed for pleasure. And so at the human level, though, we actually can coherently experience ourselves as seeking pleasure. Now, I'm wondering if it would be useful to go into some of the principles of pleasure, or do you want to go into the levels of
Wherever
pleasure
you
right
want to take
away?
us, my friend, wherever you want to take us.
Okay. Well, I think it's useful to consider some of the principles of pleasure that we're talking about, and that they actually inform how we use this map, this pleasure map, which goes through each of the levels of pleasure. And one is that the that when we talk about every level, we actually there's a Goldilocks principle of we want to have enough pleasure from all the levels, right? And actually, if we take one level and expect that level to give us all of our pleasure, it'll collapse because it's not meant to. That if we for example, if the first level is physical pleasure, the pleasure of the five senses, right? If we expect the only pleasure that we get in our lives to come out of the physical pleasure, we will be severely depressed and lead empty lives, right? And so the principle is that we want to make sure that we have a balance between all the levels.
You know, David, it seems worth
Let's see some.
pausing there with that sentence that you
Mhm.
just uh, articulated, because we live in a culture, or so it seems to me in this moment, we live in a culture that focuses on to the level of collapse on that level one pleasure that we'll explore more fully later. And it strikes me, I mean, if you think about our consumer culture, the consumer culture focuses our attention relentlessly on physical pleasure. They literally invite addiction at the sensual level. To be addicted to something is actually part of a number of media campaigns for particular foods, or come get our addict sandwich or whatever it is. So uh, in our culture, there is a bias toward excess at that level. Now, there are other levels that our culture also has kind of a pathological obsession with, but I would say more than anything, we have this, our culture has this pathological obsession with the pleasure of the senses. And I've got to believe that there's a connection between that and the resultant yearning to find excess in that, and the widespread anxiety and depression that continues to grow in our culture. It's really quite tragic what's going on, and I think a lot of it can be laid at the altar of this obsession with consuming to excess at the level of the senses.
Yeah, and I suspect, yeah, right. It's the sense in which when we disconnect from the full field of pleasure, the whole spectrum of pleasure, we actually, overindulge in one of them. And I think, Dr. Mark defines addiction as the inability to experience pleasure in ordinary
Right.
experience,
Right.
right? And so we're in the ordinary experience, we're so dulled, we're so deflated and empty that we're not experiencing pleasure. So we have to reach out and cover up that feeling of emptiness through the only thing that our culture knows as pleasure, which is the physical pleasure,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Right. Beautiful. So it's, in a
So
sense, it's
yeah.
the paucity of pleasure at the other levels that has so many in our world overload the burden on the first level of pleasure to the point of excess and therefore collapse, as you were saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a couple other principles that may be useful here is that pleasure is a skill
Hmm.
that can be trained, right? So it's not just we get it when we have it, and it's just we experience it because the cake tastes good and woo, what that's great. But we can actually train ourselves and focus our attention on all these pleasures to experiencing them. Ultimately, the goal is that we experience pleasure in every moment of our lives, and that pleasure is a compass for
Hmm.
us, a compass for how to live our unique self. And both of what you and I are working with is unique self, right?
Right. And that's a,
So that's an
I'm
important
sorry to
one.
interrupt. That's the, that's a rather radical concept. Again, at least in this culture, it seems that we can train for it rather than simply go buy it. Because we're so focused on purchasing pleasure. Particularly now, I assiduously avoid any television that has commercials in it. So even if I'm forced, by virtue of watching a sports show to watch commercials, I fast forward through them. I record and I fast forward through the commercials. But our culture gives us the impression, if we don't avoid that exposure to commercials, we are exposed to a plethora of signals, of messages that pleasure can be had, but you must buy it. Buy it here, buy it in this
Mhm.
form, buy it in that form. It's also in our relationships. Sadly enough, there's a whole uh, relationship world built around trading pleasure for pleasure. But I would say even more dominant is our commercialization of pleasure. You don't have to develop a skill at pleasure. Just go buy it.
Mm. Yeah, right. Exactly. And so we are endlessly our consumer society is built
Wait,
on
now, what
that,
do you mean by
as
skill,
you're
though? I mean,
saying.
I bet some of our viewers and listeners might ponder, like, well, what do you mean develop a skill around pleasure? Doesn't it just either happen or you go get it?
Hmm. Yeah, well, it's interesting. Um, I noticed that have you ever noticed this, Tom, that when you are making dinner for your beloved and you think a lot about, oh, I'm going to go to the store, I'm actually going to go to the farmer's market and get the fresh greens that are in season, and I'm going to go to the other store to get this bread, and I'm going to bring it all together, I'm going to be preparing all the ingredients, and I'm going to make it all homemade from scratch myself. There's some music playing in the background as I'm doing it. And then you make it from scratch, and then your beloved comes home and it's like, honey, I made you dinner. The pleasure of that
Hmm.
experience. Now contrast that to, hey, let's go out to dinner. I've got a gift card here, we're gonna go to the nearby uh, Chinese restaurant, or PF Chang's or something. The difference between those experiences, which one derives more pleasure?
Right. Right. Or to take it to another
Yeah.
level, my first date with my fiance, um, she, it was during the pandemic and early pandemic, pre-vaccine pandemic, and no restaurants were open at that point. And so I said, well, come on over, I'll cook you dinner. And she said, no, I'll come on over and we'll cook dinner together. I think there's great pleasure in cooking a meal together. So, in addition to having all the pleasure of cooking a meal, we also accessed what we'll talk about later, a second level of pleasure, which was the pleasure of, or another level of pleasure, um, without getting into the numbering yet, another level of pleasure, which is the pleasure of joining with another person in a joint venture and therefore gaining a sense of community in that process. So right there, I knew, oh, this
Yeah.
is somebody who has some skill around pleasure. She understands that cooking a homemade meal has its own pleasure, but also that cooking with someone, even if you're just meeting them for the first time, as was the case for us.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe we should go into let's go into the levels and then we can pepper in the
Great.
principles throughout. I think that might be
Beautiful.
a better way to do it
Beautiful.
because you're introducing the second one already. Um, so maybe if we go back to the first level again. So the first level is physical pleasure, and it's a pleasure of 5 senses. Oh, but here's another principle that's really important: is that every level has a genuine pleasure and a
Mm.
pseudo form of that pleasure, a counterfeit form, right? And we already started talking when we talked about addiction and covering up our emptiness by consuming things, right? To try to get this level one pleasure. But genuine level one pleasure is is actually when we're able to sit in the discomfort and let it fill up. Sit in the void and let it fill up.
Mm.
And for example, I'll just an example of a practice that I've done for a couple of years now, I guess it is. When at some point, I used to be in this habit of like when I lived alone, I would make food and then I would sort of get into a YouTube video or something and I'd watch this YouTube video while I was eating. And at some point it just didn't feel good. It didn't feel right.
Mhm.
And so what I did in order to transition this, because I had this dopamine addiction to this YouTube videos that I was watching, I would actually turn on a timer for 10 minutes, an pleasure eating timer.
Mm.
And I would sit out in the garden, I'd breathe, and I would eat, and I would taste every little morsel,
Mhm.
and I would feel it going down my to my stomach, and I'd experience the smells and the fragrances and hear the birds as they chirped, right? And looked around and looked at my food. And so this goes back to this pleasure as a skill sort of experience, but the experience is like being able to slow down and really receive the pleasures of the
Mm.
senses.
Beautiful.
So that would be an
Beautiful.
example of
Beautiful.
it.
Yeah, it reminds me, I used to co-facilitate um, a mindfulness-based stress reduction workshop at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda for a lot of the members of the staff there. And the apex of our 9-week program was a day of mindfulness, where we would do some of the processes that we had learned over the previous weeks, but everybody would bring food, and then we would eat lunch in silence, mindfully. To a person, people would report, "This may be the best meal I've ever had." And it was just regular old home. Everybody just brought their own stuff. Here's a salad, here's a pasta, here's a whatever. So it wasn't that we got extraordinary chefs to cater it for us. The big difference was that we ate in silence and we focused all of our attention on what we were eating. And so I think that's a piece of the skill you're talking about a few minutes ago. Part of the skill of pleasure is closely related to our capacity to pay attention to the pleasure. We can see this as we walk through the forest.
Yeah,
When JP and I walk through the forest across the street from the state park over here, we pay close attention to what's going on around us just for the sheer pleasure of it. Oh, look, this is starting to bloom. Oh, look, a new leaf for this tree. This will be fun to watch as it unfolds over the next few weeks. Or, oh, let's go down to the river and just listen to it for a while. So it's all about directing our attention on that rather than putting on headphones and just bopping through the woods as though we're trying to accomplish some task that is other than where we are, which is walking through the woods.
Yeah, I always found it strange whenever I would be walking in the redwoods here and I'd hear a boom box. Somebody walking with a boom box. I'm just like, what is it that you can't? There's a harmony all around you, right? A symphony of sounds, and that's just so interesting. But again, it goes back to this realization that the the experience of our emptiness, if we actually cover up that emptiness, we will do it
Right.
with a boombox. But if we actually sit in the emptiness and let it our experience fill up with the pleasure, then it'll
Which is
deeply
not to
satisfy
say
us.
that there isn't
Right.
pleasure in the
Deeply
music, but do one thing, not eight things. I mean, if you're going to listen to music, then listen to the music. You know, maybe even put on blindfolds in your living room, crank up the speakers to just the right volume, and allow yourself to be completely embraced by the music. It's the split of attention, and I think that's another dimension of the skill that we're talking about, and that is the ability to resist the cultural commodification of attention. We have notifications coming in and all sorts of commercial interests trying to grab our attention and then commodify it. And so it takes peculiar levels of skill to, in this 21st century world in which we live, to pay attention so that we can experience the pleasure that's right in front of us.
Mm, yeah. And if we had 30 hours, I mean, this whole teaching would take us, we could go for days, right? And we would go through every level and we would see that every level has a
Right.
genuine and a pseudo form. Every level has a practice. As you mentioned, attention is actually the practice at the first level, or level one is attention, paying attention. Every level has a price that we have to pay, not a financial price, but a price, something that we have to give up, right? And but I think this, this conversation will kind of go in however organically we can get through this. But yes, attention being the
Right.
practice at level one. So being able to pay attention to our sensations, and even, I like to think of this with an actual beloved, like a romantic partner,
Mm.
just like touching and actually feeling the sensation of the touch on the
Mm.
skin, the amount of pleasure that you can get from that. People don't realize that sometimes, especially, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to point fingers at different types of people, right? But we all have our automatic ways of interacting and engaging in intimacy and affection with people. And um, the we underestimate just the
Mhm.
simple touch and what it can actually do for the
Absolutely.
pleasure.
And if both people are paying
Yeah.
attention, then we can experience what Dr. Goffney calls the secret of the kiss, which is the pleasure is on both sides. The secret of the kiss is simply that if you're doing it right, you can hardly tell whether you're giving or receiving. And so if as we caress the beloved, we might, if we're not paying close attention, think that we are giving pleasure and ignore the fact that there's pleasure in the touching. So both get to gain the pleasure. And so that's another kind of magic ingredient in the interrelational sensual pleasures. And that is, are we giving and receiving at the same time? And that's intimacy, the secret of the kiss.
Hmm. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. And on another principle that can be helpful here is delayed gratification
Mm-hmm.
increases pleasure. So delaying the something that you ostensibly want, but by actually delaying the ability to get that pleasure, when you get it, it actually is all the more pleasurable,
Yeah,
right, in
absolutely.
general. Right. So yeah, that's level 1.
Let's go to
Shall
level
we go to
2.
level 2?
Take us there.
Okay. Level 2 is love, affection, and relationships. So, and the reason why they're arranged in levels is not to necessarily say one is better than another, but it's to say that there is a deeper subtlety to them, and that oftentimes the progression is kind of is bottom up in terms of how we experience them. But love, affection, and relationships, it's any relationship that we have, connection with people that derives pleasure, right? And it can be, you know, you mentioned the example with making dinner with your beloved. Now it's not just the sensual pleasure of eating and enjoying the pleasure of eating, but actually doing that in relationship with someone else and actually experiencing the bond and the trust and the mutual respect and the mutual love, right, between
Right.
us, between
And
the
of course, this
people.
isn't limited
Right.
to those primary intimate relationships either. I must confess, David, that I derive immense pleasure just from hanging out with you. Always. This has been true since we first met, first virtually and then in person, and then ever since. Every time I get together with you, I have this wellspring of pleasure that comes up in me, simply because I love the communion of Ronan and David. It's a delicious thing, this we space that you and I get to create, at least as far as I'm concerned, which is why I keep coming back for these conversations and why I'm looking forward to seeing you in June and so on. And it can be even with total strangers. In fact, sometimes some of the great pleasures I might get in a day have to do with brief moments where I'm out in the world. And I was walking down the street in Phoenix the other day, and there's a man dressed to the nines with his woman, and they were walking right downtown Phoenix. It was a beautiful day, as often happens in the winter in Phoenix, and he had a great hat on, just an incredible hat. He looked fine, and I said, "That is a fine hat." And he turned to me, and we exchanged a few words and smiles, and then we passed on and to the next thing. He went his way, I went mine, and I think both of us derived, certainly by the smile on his face, and I know by the feeling in me, we both derived great pleasure in that. Couldn't have been more than a 10, 15-second exchange at the corner. And so this pleasure that we can have from each other in community can be any kind of community we happen to choose into in the moment.
Yeah. And that was why COVID was so devastating for so many people, is that it made it harder to be in relationship in person with a lot of people, right? And almost made being in relationship a suspect, dangerous thing to do, right? But of course, we can still do it digitally, and it doesn't actually ultimately matter whether we're in person or virtually, but it's that there is a felt resonance between
Right.
people, right? There's one thing to be doing Facebook Lives videos, which I do occasionally, where I just sort of talk to the vacuum, the void, and there's another to actually be in dialogue with someone that I resonate with, and kind of the goosebumps and the hairs on the back of my neck kind of stand up when we have some resonance, right? It just makes life self-evidently
Right.
worthwhile.
As a musician, I very often am watching on
Right.
social media interviews of musicians or people in the music industry. And I came across a clip the other day of a music producer who was mildly critical of the modern way of making records, because you might get somebody lays down a track or two, maybe a bass and a drum track, and then they send it remotely across the world. Literally happens across the world to another member of their group, and then they lay a track on top of that. Now that person, that second person, is responding to the first person, but the first person is not responding to the second. And these tracks get layered on top of each other. And so each person is responding to the previous people, but it doesn't go the other way. And he was saying, I think with a fair criticism, that something is lost when the people recording the music are not together recording simultaneously. The early recordings, I mean, if you watch the Peter Jackson special on the Beatles, uh, recording over a very short period of time the music that ultimately became the Let It Be album, they recorded live in the room with each other a lot. Now, this is late in their career together, and so there was a lot of post-production layering on of wild sounds. Phil Spector came in and did his wall of sound thing on top of that. But the essence of the Beatles that we hear on those albums was recorded in the same room at the same time. And so there's this me feeling me feeling you piece that is intimacy, that is the source of so much pleasure, at least can be the source of so much pleasure at this level too.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great example, right? And I'm also thinking of the listeners might be remembering we talked about, pleasure is a compass. What does that mean? So being able to discern the relationships that derive genuine pleasure is a really important skill, right? And not just associating with any person that we happen to come across with. And one of the principles is that if it's authentic pleasure, two things happen. One is it creates yearning, not craving. So, in other words, if I'm desperate to be hanging out with someone, and I'm kind of always clinging to them and kind of like, why don't you ever hang out with me? And I can't move without you, and it's just like you're devastated and kind of craving in a very desperate way. And then on their end, they're kind of like, whoa, what's going on here? I got to get away from this person. That may be a sign that it's not, the compass is not set towards that person. On the other hand, I just had 2 weeks here with a new friend, Jeffrey, who works with editing a lot of Mark's books. He's in the guest room when he's in the Bay Area, just visiting to go to a retreat after this. And I have to say, like, he's such a deeply beautiful human being, and we just had coffee this morning, and I'm left wanting more. But but I'm also simultaneously satisfied. Like, it's not like desperate craving. It's like a yearning to deepen my relationship with this person. And so he's going to go back to the East Coast, after this, and I'd love to stay in touch, right? He's a good friend, like a new friend that I want to continue to deepen. And I was just like kind of surprised by this because I wasn't expecting to have a new friend. But this is like we resonate so much together, and we get each other, and we both have similar questions about life and that sort of thing. And so being able to discern when it's authentic is such an important skill. The second thing that happens is in the aftertaste. It tells you it's a good aftertaste, and it doesn't mean it's a literal physical aftertaste, but it's like the quality after a person is gone or after the pleasure is gone. It's like, oh, that felt good, instead of leaving kind of this like icky feeling, or like, oh man, that was a lot, or I didn't want to deal with
Right.
that, or oh, I can't wait to get away from this. Like being able to see that in the aftertaste, it actually affirms that it was a genuine pleasure that we want to
Yeah.
continue to derive pleasure from, or not.
There's a couple of things I want to
Yeah.
say about this. First, the distinction between craving and yearning. I love that you brought that up, David. There's a wonderful scene in Seinfeld. George and Kramer are in the diner, and I forget. I think it's George who asks Kramer, "Do you crave or do you yearn?" And they have one of those classic Seinfeldian conversations that is just ridiculous. And of course, George, who is the epitome of empty people, he suffers from chronic emptiness. Um, is trying to figure out how one gets from craving to yearning, and of course he has no clue how to get there, but it's something he's heard of and it sounds better than craving, so he's kind of trying to figure it out, and it's quite funny. But the the distinction is important, I think, and what you're pointing to is craving is a desire based in emptiness. It's to mask the emptiness, to cover over or to somehow compensate for the emptiness we are experiencing in a particular moment. Yearning, it comes from fullness, and it is the natural order of things. As we were saying from the beginning, it's the natural order of things at every level of the cosmos, not just human. This yearning, and it comes from fullness. It is not a yearning to fill a void. It is a yearning to evolve into something. And that's an important distinction. It's critical. And the point about aftertaste,
Right.
the aftertaste principle, certainly we can judge whether a connection or a pleasure, because this operates at all levels, the aftertaste pit. The aftertaste is a way we can look back on an experience and say, what was the nature of that pleasure? Was there pleasure there? And it's a good way of assessing in retrospect how to live, really. But we're also invited to imagine the aftertaste in a memory of the future. So we kind of fast forward our imagination and look back on it and think, can I imagine what the aftertaste will be from this experience? And maybe make an assessment as to whether it's an experience worth having. The world of dating, I'm long past that now, thank goodness. But the world of dating, when I was in it, was filled with the feedback of aftertastes. You're like, oh, that was not worth doing. In that night with that person was simply not worth doing in retrospect. And I would say one of the skills I developed painfully slowly, as it turns out, over the years was the capacity to leap into the future with my imagination and look back and say, what will the aftertaste of that be? But I think it's an important skill to be able to learn. Again, we keep coming back to the skill of pleasure, is to imagine the aftertaste so that we can assess whether a particular exploration of pleasure is one we ultimately want to pursue.
Yeah, that's great to use to put it to dating, because again, nowadays we have apps that incentivize quick hits of dopamine, and then you just swipe left or swipe right within 3 seconds of seeing a person's picture. We're encouraged to just swipe and actually not engage in a deep interaction with the other person, which it's a whole nother conversation perhaps. But to your point, to actually pause and discern and develop the skill to test the yearnings to see if they are drawing you towards somebody, and actually imagine, based on your prior experience of pleasure being with people, what could be. That's such a good example of how pleasure is a skill.
Right. I have someone I know who's going through the pain of post breakup, and he's going back and forth between the great skill required to kind of put his broader interests in the foreground and the great emptiness he's feeling, and he's navigating it beautifully. We talk often as he muscles his way through this painful time, and he's going back and forth between this craving for his former partner and the more reflective, is this really what I want? And if we got back together, would that address what I really want? So it's a beautiful thing for us to develop this capacity to recognize, oh, this is craving. Oh, this is yearning. And that's a difference. Am I trying to fill a void? And then the looking back from the imagined future is one way to assess whether I'm trying to fill a void or trying or simply responding to a natural yearning that comes from a fullness.
Yeah, you're reminding me to share about my experience living in this home. So I live in a communal home with 4 other people, and so I haven't lived communally much in my life. I often lived alone, and I often moved. So my history is in the last 15, 20 years prior to living in this home is to move houses and communities or apartments every year and a half, about every year and a half, right? So at some point I felt like, ooh, need to keep moving. I was antsy, couldn't stay still. And so I moved cities, I moved apartments, I moved countries. That was just a tendency that I had. Well, when I found this community, really for the first time in my life, and felt that there's so much resonance between us. Like it's a very heartfelt home, a heart-centered home. It's a beautiful place. It's a place where we all care about each other. We don't even have chores because everyone gets together and spontaneously
Mhm.
does what's needed to be done whenever it needs to be done. We have communal meals. Yesterday we had a meal with one of my housemates' parents, and all of us came together. We played music afterwards. And I'm finding it's been more than a year and a half since I moved in with these people, and I don't feel that
Mhm.
craving for a new community. I don't feel this void, this emptiness that has driven me to keep moving all the time. I actually feel like I can settle and breathe, and it's a healing experience, right? So this isn't just ideas. This is actually a very embodied, felt sense that when we track our desires and move towards our genuine authentic desires, it
Mhm.
actually is healing in the body. I feel like there's parts of me that have been felt like he never
Mhm.
belonged, right, in different communities, felt like I don't belong anywhere. And finally I can be like,
Right.
I can
Right.
rest.
The
I
pleasure of
belong.
level 2.
It's pleasure of level 2. It's so
Resting in
powerful.
we.
And yet
Yeah.
resting in we, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yet there's
Let's
more
do another
levels.
one.
So shall we continue? So something to remember or to notice about these levels is that every time there's a new level, it means that the pleasure has to be so great that it actually is a whole order higher or another level of pleasure. And what happens is that sometimes the pleasure is so great that we're willing to give up all of the
Mm.
previous level in order to get
Mm.
to the next level. But we don't actually have to, but it's just a human tendency that we're like, oh, I love this so much, I'm willing to give up the previous level. And so the next level of pleasure is the pleasure of standing for a cause
Mm.
or a value in the universe. So it's not about being in relationship, it's about saying, I stand for this thing and I'm going to work towards making this
Mm.
thing happen. Right. And it can be something as simple as, I have a career that I want to dedicate my life to. It could be a business venture, an organization. It could be a social cause. For many years, I studied peace studies in college, and I went to Latin America and I studied Latin American studies. I was in the Peace Corps, and I was so dedicated to making the world a better place and a kind of a multicultural understanding of that. And how do we think globally um, and reduce poverty and increase sustainability and environmental conservation? For many years of my life, that was like it was so much pleasure it gave me. There is the Peace Corps is a volunteer thing, right? You get a stipend, but you don't get paid for it by any means. 3 years I was volunteering, but I felt so much pleasure in being in this community and working towards the betterment of
Mhm.
people's lives. Right? And it was just so much pleasure that I actually, people question, like, what does this do for your career? And I said, I don't care. I just love doing it. Right. And there's those kinds of things. I remember the last little example, then I'll turn it to you, is in college. I remember I was really big into environmentalism, and I would volunteer at the local tree nursery every week just to turn compost. And I would go, and I was just so filled up with energy and excitement to turn compost because I loved being connected with the ecology, and I wanted to learn about how to make organic produce, right? And actually, permaculture was such a big deal, and wanting to be in connection with all the different parts of the system to make it sustainable and so forth. And I even at one point, my dad's company, he has a real estate company. I said to him, I for the summer during college semesters, I said to him, Dad, I would love to just do like an environmental assessment of your organization and try to improve the sustainability of all the real estate properties that you have. And I would just do it because I'd love to do it. And he was skeptical. He said, why would you do that? I'm not without being paid. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And I said, I don't know. I'm just so passionate about it, right? I was learning about it in school and I just wanted to practice it. I had a garden in the back. And again, this is a pleasure that is self-validating. It fills you up, right? If it's a genuine, authentic pleasure at level 3, standing
Right.
for a cause.
This level 3 pleasure of standing for a cause that is larger than myself is sometimes puzzling out there in the world. Particularly puzzling at my age as I approach 70 in just a little over a year. I'm often asked by people who've just met me, so are you retired or are you retiring soon? And I say, oh no, I'm just getting started. And they're baffled by it. They're baffled by it because it's not common, it seems to me, for folks to access level 3 pleasure. And I think that's a shame because there's such rich pleasure available in this notion, in the actual pleasure of standing for a cause that's greater than myself. And so when I choose to stand for the people that I work with individually or in groups, that they may know the pleasure of themselves at these various levels that we're exploring today. That is in itself a great pleasure. As I was doing some Barbara Marx Hubbard and Mark Goffney inspired journaling over a period of years that we've talked about, identifying my deepest heart's desire, I realized that at least in the public realm, my deepest heart's desire was to lead more retreats of the transformational kind of retreats that I've been leading for quite a while. And because I get such incredible pleasure out of being in a room of people who are committed to themselves and to their own transformation so that they may increase their capacity to give and receive love in the world. Well, that is absolutely a cause that I find worth committing myself to. And I'm frankly not all that interested in golf and grandchildren. I don't have any grandchildren. I'm sure when I have grandchildren, should that day ever arrive, I'll be delighted by them. But I don't think so much so that I will give up this great pleasure of committing myself to the cause that I've committed myself to.
And I imagine that there are times when you're willing to leave home and maybe not see your your sons for a while for the sake of this
Absolutely.
pleasure of level 3, standing for a cause. So it's not that you love your kids less or who be your partner less, but that it's another level of pleasure that is not available only in the relationship, level 2 pleasure. And it's not available only in level 1 pleasure of our 5 senses, right? It's something that it has a whole other order of reality that we can
Right.
access.
And the danger can be
Now,
is that we try to get, and we talked about this a bit earlier, we try to get all our pleasure at one level. And so if I load my relationship with Hubi with all my need for pleasures, then it becomes uh, it's too much. It collapses under that. And the good news about my relationship with her is that we we each understand that we are committed to something greater than ourselves, and something that is not necessarily more important, and certainly not more important than our relationship, but also is important to each of us. So yes, I have to leave her, and I'll be leaving her next weekend to further my training up in Connecticut, and we will be apart for 5 days, and so giving up the level 1 and 2 pleasures of being together in for the sake of level 3, because it's in pursuit of greater competence in this field that is related to my level 3 commitment and to my level 3 pleasure.
Yeah, and I can imagine, some listeners might be in relationships where, or you remember relationships where one of the two people is just kind of always there with the other person, right? And they actually don't have a passion or a pursuit beyond the relationship. And usually what happens is that the pleasure in the relationship actually falls apart. It starts to die because, like you said, all the pleasure is on one is focused on one level, and that level can't bear that amount of that pleasure because
Right.
it's not meant to, right? And so the relationships get dry, and the one of the people probably feels squashed, like they're
Right.
suffocating under that in that relationship, right? So the antidote is actually to breathe and to realize that we need to have all the levels of pleasure, and we have access to all the levels of pleasure, and that there's certainly overlap, right, and connection between them, but we can all find our level
Right.
3
Right.
cause. Now, there's the counterfeit, or no, actually, not before going to counterfeit. One of the principles is that if we try to freeze frame a pleasure and say, I want to keep this pleasure as it is all the time, whether, and not discover other pleasures, that causes the pleasure to disappear. Actually, you can't freeze frame a pleasure. And so, for example, at level 3, if we try to freeze frame on our cause and not let the
Mm.
cause evolve, we actually risk causing more suffering. So, just as my example, when I was in Nigeria, I was in Peru and Nigeria. I did the Peace Corps in another organization in Nigeria, and I was so passionate about the cause of development, right? International development. And I would apply to grants from the MacArthur Foundation, from other foundations, trying to get grants to keep me there, keeping me working. But what I started to notice is my body, I was sick.
Mm.
Like I had typhoid and malaria twice, and my body was longing to go home, right, and be healthy again. 2, that I actually I started to realize that the local leaders that I was working with were like done with me. Like, okay, white man, American, like, we've got this. Go home. Like, they didn't say it in that many words, but basically the feeling was there. Like, you've been here for a year and a half, and we need to take care of it ourselves now. And I was blinded for many months. I was kind of continuing to force I'm like, no, I'm dedicated to doing this. And at one point, I even was accused of, some nasty things, which I didn't even realize, like accused of being racist, right? Of like trying to be colonialist, like that sort of thing, which of course, I mean, maybe it's not of course to some people, but I had no intention of that. And I don't believe any race is superior to any others. But in any case, it came across that way because the pleasure that I was dedicated to was actually
Mm.
no longer where I was being called, right? I was forcing it. I was trying to freeze frame it to the pleasures that I've experienced up until then, when what reality was actually inviting me into was to go back home, to rekindle my relationships with my family, my friends, right? Level 2, take care of my body, level 1, and to develop my cause beyond, you know, international development, first of all, and in West Africa, right? That there was actually a cause beyond that that was more
Right.
the next step of my life, which I ended up studying something else, organizational development. I got my master's degree there, and then I worked at a nonprofit, and then, so it went on, and the pleasure continued after I was able to
And this
clarify a lot of those
ossification
issues.
of pleasure can happen at any of the levels of pleasure. And again, that comes from emptiness, a sense of emptiness, or so it seems to me. The notion that, I mean, if I were still doing what the cause, the level 3 pleasure that I dedicated my youth to, I would be miserable. The first 30 some years of my life, first 15 years of my adult life, I was absolutely positively dedicated to making a difference in the public sector. I wanted to play politics, worked in public policy, even ran for office once. And this was a childhood dream of mine to make this kind of difference in the world. And then I evolved. And I evolved to the next level and the next level and the next level. I've gone through many evolutions. One of my favorite musical albums of all time is Yo-Yo Ma's third rendition, his third album of the Bach unaccompanied cello suites. He recorded them in his 20s, his 40s, and in his right around the age of 60. And the last one he recorded, the name of the album is Six Evolutions. So even though his lifelong commitment was to music, he found new levels of pleasure as a more mature musician that acknowledged, I am an evolving being. And had I clung to earlier statements of this is what I am committed to, this is the cause I will die for, I would have ossified and no doubt become depressed. And ineffective, not just depressed, but ineffective. So I think it's an important principle that at each of these levels, we acknowledge that we are evolutionary beings and that even our notions of pleasure at each of these levels is likely to be evolutionary. And it's one of the skills, it seems to me, of a person understanding and desiring to be skilled at pleasure is to be conscious of our own evolutionary nature. We are evolutionary beings, and our pleasures are likely to evolve, and it's a key thing that we pay attention to that. David, I'm noticing that we are about halfway through the 6 levels, and we're that's probably enough for today. I want to make sure we say everything there is to about the 3rd level, but I think we say 4 through 6 for our part 2. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I was going to be
Yeah,
ambitious
no,
and
we've
like rush
taken our
through this,
time,
but
but
I'm glad
well, let's make
you're
sure that
pausing
we've
it.
said all that we want to say about level 3 for now, until later. Is there anything else you want to add on level 3? The cause, the commitment to the cause, or the value.
Yeah, right. So the practice at
Mm.
level 3 is discernment. Right? Is discernment for the genuine cause. And this is really hard because a lot of times we actually don't know when we dedicate to a cause all the implications that we're dedicating ourselves to, right? And there's so many great causes that have so many great marketing departments,
Yeah.
right? That are so great social media feeds and pictures, right? And so, if we're not careful, we can be swept away in a false cause and actually lead to endless suffering, right? In so many different ways. Um, the classical example that Dr. Mark brings up is
Mm.
communism and Marxism, in and the way that it was a cause that people wanted to equalize the society and make sure that everyone had enough economic well-being, right? And that was a cause that ended up killing probably more than many systems that ever lived, right, in the world. And so, but that's a grand example. But I mean, more daily examples are always, the company that we're working at and dedicating ourselves to, like, do we really align with the value of the company? Do we really believe in its cause, right? I mean, an obvious example is like a tobacco company. Do we want to be aligned with something like that? Or do we want to be aligned with a startup that's trying to, cure cancer or something, right? I mean, those are very different extremes. But being able to discern and actually think through, like, this is where the mind is useful at bringing to bear what kind of discernment we can
One dimension,
actually
it seems
achieve.
to me, of
That's
discernment
one of the things.
at this level 3 pleasure of the pleasure of being of identified with a value or a cause greater than myself is what we were talking about earlier, the acknowledgement of my own evolutionary nature. Oh, that was perfect for me then. It is not perfect for me now. So, for example, a part of even within the same cause, I've been dedicated to this cause that I'm dedicated now to. This cause of being an active facilitator of the evolution of love in myself and others it's evolving over time. And I'm realizing, both from changes in me and changes even in technology, that I want to do this differently than I wanted to do it 10 years ago. Some of that has to do with, I don't like travel as much as I used to. So I'm not going to, at the drop of a hat. It used to be that at this retreat center I used to lead retreats at, they would say, oh, we had an illness come up, and can you stand in? And I would fly. I was in Tucson at the time, and I would fly across the country to New York for the opportunity to do that work. I'm less likely to do that now. I still might, but I'm less likely to. And the evolution of technology has opened up all sorts of possibilities. Just the fact that you and I are able to have this conversation and share it with others in the world has helped me to discern how I want to participate in this level of pleasure. And at a certain point, that same level of discernment will also, I'm sure, guide me into an entirely new endeavor that's probably related, but an entirely new thing that I haven't even thought of yet. So I love this emphasis on the skill at the level 3 pleasure of discernment.
Yeah, and maybe the last thing I want to share that you've reminded me about, this realization that you're describing, that your pleasures can evolve, your cause can evolve. In a certain sense, it's hard to do unless we're able to let go of our cause, however temporarily. And so the first 3 levels of pleasure, actually, they all can be experienced at the level of our egos, our separate selves, which has a hard time letting go. But it's not until the next level, which we'll we'll get into next time, which is the pleasure of gnosis, 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 or true self-knowledge, that we can realize that I can hold my cause lightly because I'm more than the cause, right? But until we experience our true selves, it's actually hard to know that. It's hard to believe that. If I let go of my cause, I'm dying. Like, I'm letting go of who I am, right? And you've probably met activists that have burned out, right? We've all met, and we've been activists that have been burned out, right? Before. It's because when we put level 3 pleasure as the highest pleasure, then we are willing to risk everything to keep that freeze framed at that level. But the good news is that there's 3 more levels of pleasure after that.
That is such excellent
we'll
news,
talk
David.
about
I'm
next
so
time.
glad. This kind of sets us up. We'll have to schedule one real soon. So this concludes part one of our exploration of pleasure at all levels. David, thank you so much for having this conversation. It has satisfied my second level pleasure of hanging out with you, and my third level of pleasure of talking about um, uh, these matters. My cup overflows. So thank you.